Greetings, friends, and welcome to this World Council of Churches webinar entitled 2 Years After George Floyd's Death, Antiracism, Black Lives Matter, and the UN. 2 days ago, on May 25th, 2020, the world woke up to the tragic news of George Floyd's killing. We all remember the global outcry that followed that tragic event. It's been exactly 2 years today since the racial reckoning of 2020, as it was referred to. Tragically, it seems that the killing of Black and brown bodies still continues. As recently as 10 days ago, on 15th of May 2022, we saw in the media the tragic news of the Buffalo shooting in what has been described as a racially motivated hate crime, taking the life of 10 people and wounding 3 others in a supermarket. At the United Nations, new human rights mechanisms have been created in the last 2 years. Keeping in mind that the UN Decade for People of African Descent, 2014 to 2024, is ending in less than 2 years, what can we expect from these new bodies? What has changed in the last 2 years? These are some of the questions that we will be discussing today during this conversation. Reverend Genell Curry will be our moderator. An ordained elder in the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, he is an enrolled member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and is of Muskogee Creek heritage. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Oklahoma City University and a Master of Divinity from Phillips Theological Seminary. He's a cultural practitioner and member of the Health Pay Ceremonial Grounds. He's married to Sarah and has 5 children. Reverend Chebon, please guide us in this conversation.
Thank you, Segma. It is my pleasure and honor to be here in this capacity with, it's just, I'm humbled, and it's not me that, it's not my voice that should be the first to speak. That is my honored relatives here that's on this panel that are coming to share the work and the life-changing activities that they've been a part of. So it's my honor to be here, and I'm thankful that we continue to do this work of bringing it to the forefront of our society, how we need to continue to create change and grow together as a diverse members of creation, I guess you could say. So, but before we go any further, I know for those of us that have witnessed some of the news here in the United States, that we had just around 24 hours, not even 24 hours ago, an enormous tragedy at one of our schools for our young children, where many of them were murdered. And so we're kind of grieving this morning. So I thought it appropriate for our opening prayer. I'm going to just take a few moments of silence just to be respectful of their lives, but also to all of our faiths and our understandings, because we have many ways of articulating a prayer or articulating spirituality, and that I hope that moment of silence can capture all of our diversity. And at the conclusion of that, I might just, I know I've never sang on one of these microphones before, but I might just share a little line from one of our songs that talks about, the trail that we go down sometimes is enamored with obstacles, but at the end of, when we get to the ending point of that journey, that our Creator, God, is there with us, taking care of us. So I want to share that with us at the end of our moment of silence. So if you'll just join me for a brief moment. Yama isti miskidan ihoyana yo ihoyana yo ihoyana Yama isti miskidan Ihoyanayo, Jesus, Amaga, is oh boy dog, ye John, he chucks, oh boy dog, ye John, he chucks. Oh boy dog it, yea John, he chuck is us among. Thank you for bearing with me. That the last line, it kind of got me teary-eyed. I said, "Our children, they're there. Our children are there, standing with our Creator." And in our theology of that song, the term Jesus and God would have been, you could have switched that as the same. And so it got me thinking about all of our little ones that we lost yesterday. So thank you for that. And segment, shall I go into our introductory remarks now, if that's fine? And let us begin our time together in a reverent way, but in a way that will build our community and the work that we do together. That this event is a conversation, and we want to make sure that we point out it's not a lecture, but it will be about honoring the memory of George Floyd, who was murdered and assassinated on this very day 2 years ago, and also remembering all of the other persons just like George Floyd who have died because of racial injustice and somehow have not made it into the news. And so at this moment, I want to just say a few things for a couple of minutes, just once again, explaining my perspective and my humbleness in being a part of this conversation, because by no means does the efforts of our Indigenous communities, our Native American communities, ever want to take away from the story, from the challenge that this moment in time, when what we witnessed with Mr. Floyd, what it brings to society. And in fact, what our hope is that it will continue to affirm everything that the community stood for when we saw this moment happen in our lives, in our lifetime. It's not something that we just read in books. It's not something that we saw from another era of time in the United States, but it's something that we witnessed firsthand. And so, that's what the reason that I was asked to be here is because one of the phrases that we continually heard from certain sections of the United States, from persons, even in our ecumenical communities, was, "This is not what we are about as a country. This is not who we are." And I sat here, and I'm always kind and I'm always gentle, and I always want to bring people to another place of a better way of existing in wellness. But what I wanted to remind our country is this really is who the United States is. That this country was founded upon violence. This country was founded upon aggression and exploitation, whether it was from those that were a part of the slave trades that forced human beings to build and to labor here, or whether it was my ancestors who were forcibly removed from their homelands and forced into different areas of the country to live under military occupation. And today, that's one of the things that this voices of all of us is that the country has really worked diligently, and not just this country, but really around the world, diligently to segregate all of our voices and the respective traumas that we've been through. And there's a host of reasons as to why. And one of the things that we've seen over the past 2 years is the kind of convergence of these voices coming together saying, wait a second, this is the very same violence that I have experienced in my lifetime. One of the things I've shared with some of our communities across the country and even across the world is that early on, they believed that there were close to around, now there's many numbers and many rubrics that you can use, around 56 million indigenous peoples on this continent in this country. during the time of Trail of Tears, which was the removal, moving to reservations, the taking of indigenous peoples from their ancestral domains and territories to these places of captivity, so to speak, it is believed that indigenous peoples here lost 99.996% of their populations. That means that I myself am the descendant of the 0.004% of the survivors. This is not a statistic that is taught in schools. It's rarely even mentioned even in higher education in academia, but yet it is the legacy of this country of violence. Today, one of the joys that we have been a part of over the past 2 years has been witnessing the convergence of indigenous peoples, of African American peoples working together to tell the truth about the history of this country in hopes of preventing further violence in the future, but also in hopes of building a community of wellness for all of our children. And I say that even as I speak about, in the back of my mind is what happened just yesterday. So it is my joy, it is my pleasure, and like I said, it's not me that needs to be speaking, to at least in some capacity, bring our voices together as indigenous peoples, of African American peoples, as we work to continue to compel this country to respond to the life of George Floyd, and even the countless others who have not made headlines, but who have lost their lives. For the Black, Indigenous, and all people of color that we've seen story after story of persons suffering the same police violence. We remember their lives today, and we dedicate ourselves to bringing our voices together in hopes of ending that violence to our people. So I thank you for this few moments here, and I'll turn it back over to Seg.
Thank you, Reverend Chebon. I will now briefly introduce the panelists, and we will make the bios available in the chat room so that you get to know who they are. So in alphabetical order, we will start with Mrs. Genell Curry. She is an independent expert member of the newly created United Nations Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, which serves as a platform for improving the safety and quality of life and livelihood of people of African descent. She has worked with the UN for more than 23 years in various capacities and duty stations, including Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Timor-Leste. She oversaw the work of the OACHR New York office in support of the International Decade for People of African Descent and assisted the work of the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. While serving as the Gender and Women's Rights Advisor and Acting Chief on Global Issues in New York office, she co-led the implementation of several Security Council resolutions on conflict-related sexual violence. She led engagements with the Commission on the Status of Women and supported the work of the CEDAW Committee, as well as the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Good to have you with us, Mrs. Curry. Next in alphabetical order is Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. She is the fourth presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA. She was re-elected to serve a second 6-year term as ELCA presiding bishop at the 2019 ELCA Churchwide Assembly. She earned a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School and a Bachelor of Music Education degree from the College of Worcester. Presiding bishops' 4 emphases for the ELCA are: we are church, we are Lutheran, we are church together, we are church for the sake of the world. In 2020, under her leadership, the ELCA underwent a redesign process to help this church journey faithfully and effectively together in the years ahead. It's an honor to have you, Presiding Bishop. Third on the panel is Reverend Dr. Leah Gunnin Francis. She's a scholar, preacher, and public theologian who currently serves as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. She is the author of 2 books on clergy involvement in the movement for racial justice: Ferguson and Faith, Sparking Leadership and Awakening Community. And recently, Faith After Ferguson, Resilient Leadership in Pursuit of Racial Justice. In 2012, she was awarded the prestigious Engaged Scholars Fellowship to study issues of risk among middle-class African-American young men. She has served several congregations in Georgia, Illinois, and Ohio. She has received numerous awards for her community service and academic achievements, as well as an honorary doctorate of humane letters by Fontbonne University in 2015, and an honorary degree of Doctor of Divinity by Franklin College in 2021. She has a Master's of Divinity degree from the Candler School of Theology at Emory University and a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Good to have you with us, Professor Gunnin Francis. And last but not least, certainly, we have Professor Gay Macdougall. She has spent her career working on issues of race, gender, and economic justice in the US and in the global context. She was the first American to serve on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and President Biden has nominated her to serve a 4-year term again. In 2001, she played a leadership role in the UN Third Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa. As director of the Southern Africa Project of Lawyers Committee, she worked with South African lawyers to free thousands of political prisoners, and later was appointed to the South African body created to administer its first non-racial elections in 1994, which resulted in the historic election of the late President Nelson Mandela. Professor Macdougall is currently adjunct professor at Fordham School of Law. She is the recipient of several prestigious awards. For instance, in 2015, the government of South Africa bestowed on her their National Medal of Honor for Non-Citizens, the Order of O.R. Tambo Medal, for her extraordinary contribution to ending apartheid. Thank you for being with us again. And we are grateful to have this distinguished panel. Now back to you, Reverend Chebon.
Yes, thank you, Segma. And we'll go ahead and start with our questions for today. And the first one will be for the Reverend Dr. Leah Gunnin Francis. You have published extensively about clergy involvement in the movement for racial justice. Can you say a little bit about the role played by faith communities during the protests in Ferguson, but also how similar and different was it from the church's engagement in the Black Lives Matter protest 2 years ago? Dr. Francis.
Good morning, and thank you for having me today. When Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri in August of 2014, we saw clergy and young people and people throughout the St. Louis region stepping up and saying no more. When the young people would go and stand in the streets and say, no, we're not going inside until we get justice for Michael Brown, you saw more and more clergy coming and standing with young people, saying that, you know, we have not been here for you, coming in a spirit of humility, saying that we need to be the hands and feet of Christ right here in support of what you are doing for this cause of racial justice. Many clergy were not only preaching about it in their pulpits, but engaging their congregations in doing this kind of putting their bodies on the line work, if you will, so that you had young people saying, you know, Jesus was in the streets when they saw clergy with their collars and their clergy garb on, standing with and speaking up and speaking out against the injustice that had happened. And so as we fast forward into today and through watching what we saw 2 years ago today, where all of us watched with our own eyes how George Floyd was oh so casually murdered by a police officer with his knee on his neck and restraining him until he was no longer breathing. and to see yet again more young people and people all across this country stand up and speak up and say, we are not going to continue this anymore. We can't do this anymore. And we saw more churches get involved. You know, when I look back at Ferguson in 2014 and a lot of local congregations in the St. Louis region, there were some that were really getting involved. What we saw just 2 years ago were more churches around the country that were standing up and speaking out, because as you all may recall, that shortly after George Floyd was murdered, there were protests breaking out in every major city around the United States. And quite honestly, I believe that not only were people outraged about what was happening and happened to George Floyd, but there was fresh memory from people all around this country of individuals in their cities that had been murdered by those who were sworn to serve and protect. So you saw more churches speaking up and standing up and saying that we can't continue in this way. The challenge is that there still have not yet been enough. We see that even though there are clergy that have been speaking up, that continue to do that, that have stood with this movement that said, yes, Black lives do not matter in the same way as white lives, and they will not until we make that so. There just have not been enough congregations. There have not been enough clergy that are willing to say that white supremacy, that white privilege, that racism is one of the greatest threats to this country and the flourishing and well-being of Black and brown people. And so until that happens, until we get more congregations and more people of faith that are willing to step up and step out and resist this movement where we see inside of many churches, inside of many congregations that, you know, are tacitly complicit at best and straight out condoning it at worst, all in the name of God, that has to be confronted. And so, you know, where we have seen more churches get involved since the killing of Michael Brown and Ferguson, all the way up through George Floyd and into the US Capitol insurrection, there still are not enough. There is still a stronghold within Christianity of this wrapping of Christian nationalism, of taking the cross of Christ and wrapping the American flag around it, all in protection of white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Francis. And I'm invoked, I want to say more, but we must go on with our agenda because there's so much truth and power in what you've just shared with us. At this time, we'll turn over to Bishop Eaton. Could you share briefly about the role that your church played in denouncing the extrajudicial killings of Black people and other forms of racial injustices following these two or other racially motivated incidents? Bishop Eaton.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Our response, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, was really not a top-down response. Our people, our pastors took to the streets, as Dr. Francis said, was so necessary. They provided care and prayers and bottles of water for folks protesting or showing up, particularly in Minneapolis. Just to give you a couple of examples, so pastors Angela Kabeb and Ingrid Rasmussen, both of Holy Trinity Church, which was located just 3 miles from where George Floyd was murdered, they were in the path of the protests. So they set up a clinic and they delivered food and kept watch for their neighbors as the protests were going on. And as people began arriving to the site where George Floyd was murdered, Dr. Kelly Sherman Conroy of the Lakota people showed up and saw the need to train local pastors, and many of them white, on how to become chaplains ministering to those traumatized, to be culturally aware, to de-escalate and to check their privilege. She trained the first 30 chaplains And then she started holding daily trainings and has trained over 250 chaplains, most of them from the Twin Cities in the United States, in the area where George Floyd was murdered. And after the murder of Daunte Wright, Pastor Jenny Sung from Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Brooklyn Park worked to provide support to the families living near the area where protests were going on. The church was able to place 40 people, including families with children, in hotels until things in the neighborhood were able to settle down. So these are just very concrete examples of our people, pastors, chaplains. Kelly's a PhD student, or has earned her PhD, and our people in the path of this, deciding not to board up their doors, but to open their churches and their communities to help those who were expressing their outrage and grief in actual service. Secondly, our churchwide organization develops resources for congregations so that these congregations and our people can prayerfully immerse themselves in the issues and to discern what to do in these particular settings where they are, with the limited power and agency in some ways and influence that they have. So one resource is for us, Declaration of People of African Descent, and it's a study guide. So we passed this declaration, the ELCA Declaration to People of African Descent in 2019, 2016, pardon me. And we've published now a study guide so congregations can just have their eyes open to the realities. I think we are the whitest mainline denomination in the United States. And so the air we breathe, the water we swim in is white. And our folks are not, as we've heard before, even aware of these issues. So how do we help our people become aware and begin to talk about this? We also have begun work understanding that there's an intersectionality about this, that we are working hard on our repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, as well as participating in Shoulder to Shoulder. We're founding members, and these are Muslims, Christians, and Jews standing together shoulder to shoulder to promote not just coexistence, not just tolerance, but acceptance and also protection for Muslims. And also we're aware of the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, particularly during the last administration, and with that administration's characterization of the Omicron, the virus, COVID virus, being the Chinese flu, he would say. That emboldened people, and I think legitimized people who wanted to participate or perpetrate these racist acts. But we know there's still a lot to do, as we've already heard. The intentional murder by someone who was poisoned by the false ideology of the replacement theory, by murdering 10 people in the grocery store in Buffalo. And we've heard already that the United States is awash in gun violence. And so yesterday, little children and their teachers were murdered. So we know we have a lot of work to do. And we pray, knowing that we can't do this by ourselves, for the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And we are naming, not all over the church, but we are naming the reality of white supremacy and white privilege, which makes white people really nervous to hear that, because we would say, well, we're not burning crosses and other things. However, what people don't understand is that this country now, whether we intended it or not, is set up to advantage white people and whiteness, and that disadvantages, with deadly consequences, people of color. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do, but also recognizing that there is much, much more to get done.
Thank you, thank you, Bishop Eaton. And we'll go to our next set of questions. In the 20th century in the United States, the lynching of Emmett Till, coupled with Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in a bus, were the starting point that fired up the 20th century civil rights movement. Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson resulted in nationwide protests in 2014-2015, which were somewhat covered by international media. Floyd's killing in 2020, however, resulted in global protests that shook the world. Although both were the result of police brutality, the world reacted indifferently to both cases. So our first question will go to Professor Gay Macdougall. As someone who has committed all her life to racial justice, including during the time of the WCC program to combat racism, how can you explain this? But also, what is the trigger that explains that some of these events spark a stronger call for change more than others? Professor Macdougall.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you very much for having me here. I have followed the work of the World Council of Churches on Racism, perhaps, you know, for, let's see, at least 30 years, probably more. And so, you know, what the World Council of Churches has been doing over that time has been foundational. But I would say your question is very important. One, why now? And it's not quite that linear. I'm a child of the era of Emmett Till. I remember sitting on my front stoop at my house reading Jet magazine and seeing the pictures of his mangled body in his casket. So I have a real life, you know, timeline in my mind from then till now. And, you know, every moment is its own. But I would say that what happened 2 years ago was a confluence of a number of things. There was, of course, the power of the internet and the power of social media, which we did not have before. And I would say that the cell phone technology and era has made a tremendous difference in the difference between the Emmett Till murder and the reaction to it. All we had then was Jet magazine and African-American media. But now we had a courageous 17-year-old girl who stood on that corner and videoed the total 9+ minutes and broadcast it to the world. And, you know, we had a pouring out into the streets of people, not just in the 50 states of this country, but in at least 50 countries around the world. And it was shock and grief that was being displayed throughout the world and throughout those initial, you know, demonstrations. But along with that, you had the importance of the movement infrastructure, which was at the ready. The Black Lives Matter movement did not start with George Floyd. It started with Michael Brown's murder. And it waned, but the infrastructure was honing itself. And so when George Floyd's murder occurred, it was ready, and people not only, you know, poured out into the streets in anger. We had a movement infrastructure that transformed that into something that could be sustained and could be meaningful. Also, during that period, between, let's say, Michael Brown's murder, if you will, and George Floyd's murder, I think there had been real increasing frustration at the lack of progress about murders of people, innocent people in the streets. Few people realize that there are about 1,000 people killed like Michael Brown, innocent, without any weapon, and ultimately without any justice. And so this frustration and anger have been building, and anger at the lack of any real progress, even during the time of democratic administrations and politicians, et cetera, unable to break through any deadlock in the gun that had been created by the gun lobby or the other party. So there was real anger and frustration that was that had metastasized throughout this country and again around the world. And I think that in the period between Michael Brown's murder, let's say, and George Floyd's, we had developed, we in this country, we developed a more incisive analysis and reference points, let's say, a new language to call out ancient injustices. We were willing to talk about white supremacy as never before. We were willing to talk about the importance of not just declaring you're not racist, but being deliberately, intentionally, aggressively anti-racist. We were willing to talk about abolition and white allyship. And so there was a flood of new scholarship that supported all of that. So I think that, any movement that has impact is built on many things that have been developed and are in waiting for the right time to be used. And I think that's what we found was the case around around George Floyd's murder. We were able to build new mechanisms at the United Nations to address racial injustices. And I think we'll get a chance to talk about that a little later. But as has been the case in the past, and as I tell my students, I've been here before. And if we don't really take deliberate and aggressive and sustained movement toward justice, it wanes. And people say, remember when we were on the streets about George Floyd? Well, what happened after that? The future is in our hands. We've got to make this make a difference. And, I think we owe it to George Floyd, and we owe it to Michael Brown, and we owe it to many, many others whose names we can't recite at this time. But we have to stop this.
Thank you, Professor Macdougall. And I think one of the more profound remembrances is realizing how far technology has come when we document these injustices, such as social media. We think about even just the onslaught of TikTok. All of these things have contributed to this worldwide knowledge now that we know we can send an instance across the world, within a matter of seconds. So thank you for sharing that with us today. We'll go on to this next question will be for our next panelist, for Miss Genell Curry. This question will be for you. How can you explain that in the same manner that the world reacted so strongly to Floyd's death in comparison to other similar events? Ms. Curry.
For the question. Am I muted? Sorry, I am unmuted. Thank you. And I started by saying thank you. So this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about this, right? I think that Gay Macdougall just mentioned one of the main issues I wanted to talk about in terms of timing and the power of the social media. So I think she said that. I won't go into that again. What I think we need to think about, and what was clear in my mind, is what else was happening in terms of timing around the globe. Because George Floyd's death had, as Gay just mentioned, was a global response, right? It wasn't just sort of demonstrations in the streets in the US, it was across the globe. And so for us, what was happening for us back then in many developing countries and around the world was the pandemic. We were on lockdown. The impact of our inequalities was suddenly very much in our faces, right? And I think I'm speaking about socioeconomic inequalities, particularly in terms of health, in terms of labor, in terms of what was happening for poor Black people around the globe and for others. These things became even clearer during for us during the pandemic. So inequalities in terms of education, as kids were being, the kids of wealthy children were certainly continuing their education. Many poor children and marginalized and vulnerable groups of children were being left out, were being held, but were being denied, and this sort of education gap was growing, and recognizing there was a lack in technology, lack of devices, lack of alternative opportunities for children. And I know in my own country, we have a population that's the Bahamas, about 300,000, sorry. And I heard the statistic that some 17,000 children never logged on in the 2-year period of the pandemic. And all of this sort of happening in society of the lockdown and the anxiety that brought about, and the realization of the inequalities of us, predominantly Black people, the arbitrary detention of poor people, of homeless people for venturing out during the lockdown, looking for food, looking for water, and being suddenly criminalized. And all these issues, I think, across Latin America and Caribbean, where you have large populations of Blacks, became very real. Inequalities around gender and women's rights, particularly, the rights of women to a life free from violence, that violence against women in domestic setting became very, very real. And a lot of, and somebody mentioned earlier the issue of intersectionality, of the situation of Black women and what that actually meant for them, many of whom were breadwinners for their families and so forth, unable to work, unable to provide, and still facing. I think all of this happening at the same time where we're sitting and watching this on television and watching this through social media, watching this murder, saying, wait a minute, this is still happening to us. And we're frustrated and angry at many of what else is going on in our countries and in our spaces, and saying, why is this still happening to us? How can this be allowed to continue to happen to us? And at the time, I was still with the UN, and I have to say, not only across countries, but that sort of why question that popped in our minds because of George Floyd's murder and the brutality of that murder was also very much a question for us in institutions, in the United Nations, for an example. Initially, when it happened, we wanted to go to the streets, and we were told, you cannot go to the streets. That was a direct policy decision by the seniors within the UN. And I'm like, but I'm a Black person. This is something that angers me, that I want to demonstrate, I want to say something, and suddenly I can't. I think what became clear to us is that we had to speak out, we had to speak up. And George Floyd's murder gave us our voices, even within the United Nations. And not because the United Nations works to end discrimination, it means that everybody working in the United Nations is anti-racist. That, of course, is not the case. So when we began to sit around and talk among ourselves as Black people in the organization, what was clear when we started voicing for the first time, and I had been in the organization for over 20 years, this is the first time that we came together as a group, or in groups of Black people and people of African descent, and other minorities also joined that group. And because what was clear is I joined in 1998, and I was the only Black person of 70 in the treaty bodies branch. And I went back to Geneva. I moved around a bit. I went back to Geneva in 2018, and there were like 4, right, professionals. And so not much had changed given that long span of time. So we were starting to say, what is it? We recognized that we were still experiencing racial discrimination within the United Nations. We had been rendered invisible over those years, voiceless, denied opportunities, denied upward mobility, denied exposure and development, sidelined, shouted over, talked down to, and called disparaging names. Several of us had witnessed, sort of been promoted over and this kind of stuff. All of these things were happening at a time that we felt that we should be bolder because of what had happened to George Floyd. Because people were marching in the streets, we had to say something, and we wanted to say something. I mean, for us, we had to find our voices, right? We recognize that that Black people had in the organization had witnessed some of the worst discrimination. And what was even harder for us as Blacks, we were considering ourselves to be educated, privileged, and having that opportunity. We had made it out, but that was not the case, because racism continued to hold us in our place within an organization such as the United Nations. So we found our voices to express that fatigue, right? We found that voice to say that racism is humiliating. It's humiliating for us who have educated ourselves. Doesn't matter, we're Black. It's humiliating for us. It produces that kind of fatigue that lives in the cells of Black people, and was living in our cells and quietly dormant there. And we had to find a way to express it. And that momentum that we found came out of George Floyd, as a result of George Floyd's death, came out of, as a result of that march, those demonstrations globally. And I recall going to the demonstration in Geneva with my 9-year-old daughter and saying, hey, we have a voice. And she didn't know what she was really, I guess, saying, but, you know, stop the racism. We as Blacks want to have equal rights. And that, I think it was such a timely moment for us. A lot was happening at that time. And I think it just brought out all that was within Black people, the frustration, the anger, the fatigue that was pending for so many years. And I'm hoping that this momentum, we cannot let it go at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Curry. Like I shared a moment ago, every presentation, every speech is invoking this emotion from me that I want to. I wish we had days to talk about this, to start putting the pieces together of our fragmented experiences of, you know, it's the same perpetuator of violence that has impacted all of our communities as people of color. And even just listening to requests to not take to the streets, that invokes something in me, because I'm reminded of this historical normalizing of our experiences that we're taught and ingrained in us to, oh, that's not a big issue, or, oh, that's how things should be. That's how the way of the world is. And what we're seeing in the past 10, 15 years is that that's no more. We're demanding equality. We're demanding equity. You know, we just want the right to live is what I share with people. So thank you for your contributions and for sharing that, because I think even as clergy, we've gotten that discrimination to say, well, you shouldn't be out there protesting. You shouldn't be out there. But what more can you do? We've written letters. We've gone and tried to have phone calls. We've had meetings with persons. Sometimes that's all we can do is go to the streets and say, this is what we're going through. So thank you, Ms. Curry. Well, we have another set of questions here. I want to go and work our way through them. And then after that, we'll have a few moments of some questions and some answers, some interactions before we go to the final section for today. But I want to go ahead and turn back to Bishop Eaton. Is that you are one of the endorsers of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement. Can you share a little bit about this movement? And according to you in the US, what has been the contribution of Christian nationalism in reinforcing white supremacy and racial subjugation? Bishop Eaton.
Thank you. I would say white Christian nationalism is a serious threat to people, to our country, and a serious threat to the truth of the gospel. It's actually, I would say that it's anti-gospel, and it is set up to perpetuate and enforce the notion that to be a real American, one has to be a certain kind of Christian, and one basically has to be white. We had this really egregious example of one of our governors in one of our southern states saying the other day that if they factored out the mortality of Black mothers, that their state would be just like everybody else's, which meant that somehow the Black mothers didn't matter. They weren't people. But Christian nationalism enshrines this. It conflates the notion of America with being the new Jerusalem or the new promised land. And this has been a part of, I think, American exceptionalism since the 17th century. But it's really has gained momentum now. And I think it has gained in some ways legitimacy among people. So I don't know if you remember or if you were able to see January 6th, the insurrection that tried to take over the Capitol of the United States, when we were trying to exercise our history of a peaceful transfer of power. But the symbols in that insurrection were a large cross was erected along with gallows and a noose. So it's frightening to take a look at this, and it is completely, I think, appropriated Christian symbolism in ways that are untrue and really dangerous. This is our work against Christian nationalism and being Christians against Christian nationalism is our attempt to do what we can to say that this is a dangerous and damaging political ideology that seeks to merge, as I said, Christian and American identities, particular American identities, white, particularly kind of Christian identity. And it's just a distortion of the American experiment when we can perhaps be at our best. And it's a complete distortion of the gospel. And in this understanding, it demands that Christianity of a certain kind be privileged over by the state over any faith group. And so our own people don't really remember that the first clause of the First Amendment is that the government shall make no provision for establishing religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But the Christian nationalism says, yes, a particular kind, of Christianity should be privileged by the state. Well, you can see what has happened. Mosques are vandalized. People in their synagogues are murdered. Catholics are not seen as being fully American. So this is all going on here, which is extremely, it's just toxic. It's toxic. But unfortunately, I think we've seen that this notion, as I said, has been legitimized, and that people are holding this up more and more, which is not how we understand ourselves. So we often have these controversies whether or not the 10 Commandments can be displayed in public places like courthouses or mayor's offices or schools. But the 10 Commandments are numbered differently. You know, Catholics and Lutherans have a different way of numbering the 10 Commandments than, say, Methodists and Presbyterians and others. So when they put these things up, they don't number them. They number them according to this majority understanding by a particular set of Christians, which is really interesting. So, you know, we tell my people, you know, we don't want that to be going on there. The white supremacy part is insidious and completely a part of Christian nationalism. And I think now we're seeing more and more, at least people saying out loud and protesting or working against in their own way, the notion of, or supporting, pardon me, the notion of the replacement theory, which is This is not new in the United States. It used to be wielded against Eastern European migrants, but now it's really specifically targeted toward targeted against Black, Indigenous, and people of color in order to say that this country is being ruined because white people will not have the majority and we must work against it. That was the ideology that sent that man with a gun to murder 10 innocent people just doing some grocery shopping. And we can see also the history of this when if you're not white, if you're somehow not this particular form of Christian, that in fact it's the duty of white Christian nationalists to civilize people who don't fall into their understanding or their criteria of what it means to be a real American, which unfortunately is just it's not what it means to be a real American. And we're knowing. See, this is sometimes when I think, maybe I'm not always optimistic, but I'm hopeful. But we know in the United States that by the middle of this century, white people will no longer be a majority. We might be a plurality. And but we're also seeing that as we've heard from our other speakers, that times are changing, that people have seized upon the murder of George Floyd, not just in the United States, but around the world to say this has got to stop. And so maybe I hope what we're seeing is just the last gasp and last grasp by people who feel that the power ratio is changing. And I think people get more violent when they feel that when things are about to change. That's my hope, because I'm afraid sometimes that we will fall back into those ways of thinking and behaving that would support white Christian nationalism and certainly white supremacy and white privilege. And we've heard from our other speakers how damaging this is at a cellular level. This is generational injury that happens over and over again. So I'm praying that this is just an indication that times are changing. We find in our country from those who've studied this in the United States that Christian nationalism is more likely to fear and distrust religious minorities, including Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. And they're more likely to condone police violence toward Black Americans and distrust accounts of racial inequality in the criminal justice system. That people engaged in Christian nationalism believe racial inequality is due to the personal shortcomings of the minority people, of the minority groups. And they report being very uncomfortable with both interracial marriage and transracial adoption. They hold strong anti-immigration views and they fear refugees. And we're seeing that play out in the United States as we've been struggling to welcome the stranger, as we are bid in Scripture. But we can see that playing out, and Christian nationalism sort of leads the way on that one. We believe that when we're confronted as the ELCA and others with this threat of Christian nationalism, that we have the name to say this is idolatry and to denounce this, that it's not America first. I think what's the first commandment? You shall have no other gods. I believe that's in there. And we can see that we've turned this idea, this notion of Americanism and Christian nationalism into an idol. And as I said at the beginning, we could see this on display during the insurrection when Christian symbols were prominently displayed, even as a noose was hung and people were seeking to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power in our country. So there's clearly, as I said before, a lot of work to do. But our denomination, along with others in the United States, are part of this coalition to work against Christian nationalism, to denounce and make it clear that racism is a sin and that Christian nationalism is an affront to the gospel and is a false idol.
Thank you, Bishop Eden. And Eden. And I also want to just put a gentle reminder out there that it has, in the grand scheme of time, the white majority has only been here in this continent for a small period of time, less than 300 years. Muskogee ancestors that come from mound builder communities of the southeastern part of the United States have been in that region alone for, I believe it's around 16,000 years of indigenous peoples. So I just want to throw that out there as we talk about these things, because it really adds to what's fueling this Christian nationalism movement, is that it's really only a small period of time where this reality has been there and this violence has occurred. So, but we also, before we go on, we want to just ask Dr. Francis to give some inputs also on this Christian nationalism response.
Yes, yeah, I echo and appreciate everything the bishop has said in relationship to that. And, as we think about Christian nationalism and the role that white supremacy plays in the promulgation of that, we have to remember that this has been a historical practice in this country within Christian churches pretty much since the very beginning. Dr. Robert Jones has done fantastic work in his books like White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, to help us understand that this is the legacy of Christianity in this country, that from the very beginning, the ways in which Christianity, the Bible, the liturgical acts of prayer and scripture and other practices have been used to subjugate Black people, to decimate our society in ways that dehumanize people that were non-white, and has carried through all the way up until this day. Let's remember that when lynchings were popular in this country and happening on regular occasions, there would be often times where people would meet on Sundays in congregations, the bells would toll, and they would leave out of their congregations, white people, and go out into the square where a lynching was occurring. So this conflation and the ways in which Christianity and sort of Christian nationalism has done the work of promulgating white supremacy for centuries in this country cannot be overstated. And to look at what we saw on January 6, 2021, the symbols, as already been said, about the noose and the gallows. Also, don't remember that after the mob of people stood at the foot of the US Capitol, you had a line of police officers standing there trying to keep people back, trying to not let people go forward. But what did they do? Did they say, oh, we're sorry, officers, we don't want you to feel threatened in any kind of way, so we're just going to turn around and go home? That's not what they did. They pummeled through the police officers, hit, pushed, beat with flag poles, and made their way all the way to the floor of the Congress while Congress was actually in session. What continues to stun me to this day is we watched this happen before our eyes, and police officers didn't feel threatened enough to pull their weapons at the foot of the Capitol. Clearly, there was a directive that they could not do that, obviously, because is that not the explanation for why so many Black and brown people have been killed by police? What do they say? I felt threatened. You mean to tell me that the police officers at the foot of the Capitol didn't feel threatened as this mob of people beat them, forced their way through, and made their way all the way onto the floor of the US Capitol, stealing classified documents and the like? And then when they get there, you see people, what did they do? They took off their hats and said a prayer. Again, another very explicit religious act, assumably Christian, conflating and promulgating this notion of the cross of Christ and the American flag wrapped around to promote white supremacy.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. And we'll go ahead and move to our next question. And this will be a little bit for all of our panelists. And following this, we'll pause for a little interaction with some of our questions. And I know there's a couple that have come through our chat there. We'll take a look at those. And I have a host of notes if we ever find time that I want to just keep adding to as well. But this next question, in the aftermath of Floyd's death, the concept of anti-racism was revived. We saw several literatures published on this issue. Concretely speaking, what does it mean to be anti-racist? How does it translate in practice? And we'll start with Dr. Francis. Can you give us a response?
Sure. Anti-racism first acknowledges that racism is in the air, it's in the water, it's in the soil. What I mean by that the system of racism in this country and globally we know, but specifically talking about this country, and the way that has shown up in every facet of our society, there is an acknowledgement of that. And so when we think about our institutions, whether they're the institution of our church, whether it's our corporations, companies, that the very structure, the very founding, the very construction of these things have been racist to the core. Black people have been left out, not seen as human in the same way, and have experienced a very different way of living and being as opposed to white people. And so that's the first thing. Anti-racism acknowledges the systemic nature of racism in this country. This is not just about, oh, am I racist in my heart? How does my heart feel about this? No, this is about the system of racism. So to be anti-racist is to not only acknowledge that, but to be actively working to correct these systems of injustice. And that can't be overstated. Again, we've got to move away from just this personal, how I feel, whether or not we can change hearts. No, we can't change hearts, but we can change policies. We can change legislation. We can change the construction of our organizations. We can, as the church, acknowledge, recognize our complicity in the history and up until this day of promulgating white supremacy. That these are the things that we can do. So to be anti-racist is to do that. But what do we find ourselves doing? We find ourselves being confronted with this manufactured hysteria around critical race theory, where there has been a well-funded movement in this country to put out there in the water that any teaching of history that in any way acknowledges the truth about how this country was founded, the violence, the damage that was done to indigenous people, to Black people, et cetera, is, oh, that's just, you're making us feel bad. We don't want our children learning that. And it's gotten to a point where legislation has been passed to ban books, to prevent teachers from teaching the truth about history, to make it such that there can be any honest conversation about the history of race and the way racism shows up today. So this is what we're dealing with. This is the extent of the damage that has been done, that is being done, and that is seeking to make it such that the generations coming behind us know nothing of the truth as to how we came to be.
Thank you. Also, Professor McDougall.
Well, wow, I can't say anything after that, but amen, sister. You hit all of the points there. I think that I just got to endorse every word that you said. So, go, Reverend Shavon, go to the next one.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Ms. Curry.
Yes, I too endorse what was said. I will add a few points. Looking at the sort of more global and particularly regional focus of this particular issue for us. So around, and I'm talking about people of African descent in this particular situation. Now we know that racism happens to others as well. But around 200 million people living in the Americas identify themselves as being of African descent. Many millions more live around the world, in Europe and other places outside of the African continent. The circumstances in which they live and the challenges they face are different, and they differ, of course. What is common among them, however, is that they all historically face racism and racial discrimination. Often systematically, and that's the point that was just made. This is a systemic situation, systematically in their daily lives, across sectors and in different spaces, they experience racism and racial discrimination. I'm speaking about structural and institutional racial discrimination, how this happens within institutions. I mentioned in my previous response about how it exists in an institution like the United Nations, whose charter speaks about equality and non-discrimination. So it's about how do we address this, how to dismantle the structural and institutional racism and racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerances. It's about inequalities and marginalization, stigmatization. It's the low levels of participation of Black people in key places, in political spaces, in leadership within the UN. We had pressed to find female Blacks in those, particularly, and we look at, somebody else spoke about intersectionality, Black women, definitely not sidelined, stepped over, not given the same opportunities. The lack of adequate representation in the administration of justice, whether they are presumed innocent until proven guilty, depends often on the color of their skin or which shade of Black. And we have to mention also that issue around colorism, because people favor you when you're a lighter skinned Black. I have experienced it being a darker skinned Black person. So barriers to inequality and enjoyment of the full rights of human rights, particularly with regard to poverty, those living in poverty, and a lot of those are Black persons. In the United States, of course, but globally, Black persons are often at the bottom of all socioeconomic scales when we're looking at who we're talking about. Inequality in terms of access to the labor markets, in terms of opportunities within the employment sector. We're there forced to work, which is often in the informal sectors in many of our countries. You know, who gets to control the economy? Who decides what we eat? We have about 5 or 6, families in my country that basically, control food. And we'll say when, what will come in and what will not come in, basically. Those are the kinds of issues I'm talking about. Profiling of Black people, racial profiling. When you go to the airport, am I going to be randomly selected for checks when I go in airports like Charles de Gaulle, which has often happened to me. And across Europe, I've traveled a lot, and I'm often, very often, sort of randomly checked, right? And we question that. It's, the intolerance of who we are, how we wear our hair, what religions we practice, is that kind of intolerance. So as was just said, it's not just opposing racism, and all of us say, we hear our colleagues and friends and others in the media say, but I'm not racist, but your actions are very racist. Right. And so for me, anti-race and anti-racism, it really a person that opposes racism and takes deliberate steps to act on racial discrimination. It's someone that is not just going to be passive about it, but is going to take real action. And many of our colleagues do not realize that they are indeed. And I don't think people are just born racist and it's in them and that's all who they are. I think they have moments of demonstrating whether they are anti-racist or racist, right? And I just want to share one small story and then I'll end. And I give an example. And this happened very recently in the workspace, where we're recruiting a junior officer, and we're around the table, and I make the comment, because it's a team that is 100% European, and I said, guys, can we pay particular attention to Asia, Africa, and Latin America? Because we need diversity around the table, not because I like Black people around the table only, although I love to see them around the table, but because we need their voices to be heard, and they have something to contribute to this development. We cannot continue to direct what happens to them. They should have some say around that development table. And when they're not there, we're speaking, or Europe is speaking for them. And I made that comment that, you know, Asia, Africa, or Latin America, and a colleague of mine, and I will not say the nationality, but a European colleague of mine said, oh, but Genell, people from those parts of the world are not well educated. I mean, flat in my face. And I'm thinking, but this is 2020. You know, you cannot still be saying this. And I said, are you kidding me? Are you serious? And oh no, I don't mean you, Genell. So they now try to separate me from this. I said, you do mean me, because I am those persons. I am one of those people, right? But whether you mean me or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is that you have just sidelined, discriminated against persons from Asia, Africa, and Latin America as being uneducated, unqualified, inadequate, lesser human beings than European people. And that, I will say, is not the bane of it. What was the anti-racist part to me that came really, really clearly is that no one in the room spoke out against this guy. Nobody said, that is not the right thing for you to say. And to me, that would have been an anti-racist act, not just telling me I'm not racist, but when you speak out and you say, this is wrong, but that to me is being anti-racist. When you take a deliberate step to oppose racist actions or to oppose intolerance, that's being anti-racist. And when you're silent, whether you say you're racist or not, to me, you're racist. Right? And because you condone what has just been said, and you leave me to fight that battle as the only Black person in the room. The actions don't have to be big. The actions can be quite small. It's just about saying, it's about speaking up, standing up, listening up, and saying what is just right, fair, at the appropriate moment within your sphere. I don't need you to go on national TV and say it to everybody necessarily, but within your space, within your sphere, make it about anti-racism. Thank you.
If I can then take my turn, just to add one more point, because I think Genell has been excellent, and especially at bringing up this example, because there's another thing at play in that example that I think is very important to point out, and that is the assumption that everybody else at that table is highly educated. The assumption that the decision about quality, about merit, is all about what exists in a certain culture. And that has actually robbed the world, humanity, of a lot of the benefits that can come from inclusion of other points of view. You know, and so, you know, the thing, you know, the knee-jerk, if you will, reaction in, at least let me say in the US, is that you should not be intentional about including people because they are different. I say you should be intentional about including people who are different. First of all, it makes the outcome of the discussion and the outcome of decision-making always better. And, you know, also, that is the anti-racist position. It is to understand that what we have now is about white privilege. That's white privilege. It's the atmosphere, the assumptions around that table that allow someone to conclude that people from the global north are educated and people from the global south are not. That's white privilege, because it also means that they are never challenged. So they never have to prove their merit. They never have to prove their worth. So, you know, I think that there is a lot. The point about anti-racism is that you have to oppose every aspect of the racial structures that are determining this world. And I think Genell speaks eloquently about the United Nations, in which, you know, it is a racist structure constructed by, you know, by the imperialists of the world, when they thought that only global North countries mattered and would only be decision makers. And they have had a terrible time dealing with the influx since the early 1960s of countries from the global South that have gained or fought or become independent, self-determined nations, and therefore deserving of their own vote, equal vote within that body. So I think that anti-racists are those that critique the entire structures and see that this is not about one person or another person. It's the whole structures that we live in, the way we have to write in these structures, the way we're forced to think about things, the outcomes, the way we dress, as Genell says, the way we have to do our hair. But you know, most importantly, the limited capacities of the institutions as a result of denying the input, the full input of everybody. Thank you for letting me in again.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, Professor McDougall. We just have a few more minutes, so I'm going to have to amend our agenda in today. But I do want to give Bishop Eaton a couple of minutes to respond also to that question of anti-racism. And then following that, I'm going to just ask a question on a message of hope for about 30 seconds each. I know we're getting to the end of our time, and I could sit here and listen for days. But Professor Eaton, excuse me, Bishop Eaton, a response to the anti-racism conversation.
Well, thank you. I say amen to what the other panelists have put out there, and I think for white people that this really is this is work that we have to do. And one important, what maybe the most important part about this is to realize this is not talking about individual dispositions, that this is not an individual problem. And so we can point elsewhere at someone else who's behaving another way, but it's absolutely systemic, it's institutional, it's organizational, and we see this over and over again. And white people don't. We think this is the way the world is set up because of the myth that the Europeans coming to this part of the world and wherever else we went have earned everything we've gotten and deserve it, and other people, as we've heard from our last two speakers, somehow are less than. Quick story, my father flew in the United States Army Air Corps during World War II. He had a bomb group, and you know, he flew, fought in the war, but their escort squadron was the Tuskegee Airmen. So those men protected my father and others during the war. When they came back, we had a program in the United States called the GI Bill, which made sure that loans and college admissions and other housing would be available to veterans. Now, on paper, it was supposed to be equal, but in fact, my father could take advantage of that, but Black people who served in the same war and wore the same uniform were barred from that. That's white privilege. My father didn't create it. Doesn't mean my father didn't work hard or wasn't a brave man, but simply because he was white, he could take advantage of these benefits given to him, and men who fought alongside him, risking their lives, could not because they were Black. White people have to understand this. It's not our fault, but now that we know that this exists, that's the work of anti-racism. We have to dismantle that. So I'll end it there because my sister said so much better.
Thank you, Bishop Eaton. And so now we come to the time of maybe we can just have a 30-second message of hope that we send out to our folks, some words. One of the things that I witnessed coming from George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Movement protest, was the convergence of our communities coming together and advocating and walking hand in hand and side by side with each other, sharing the narrative, sharing the story about our experiences, but also just sitting there and giving that that support, saying we will stand in solidarity with communities that are suffering. And even in here in the state of Oklahoma, which is everything that you said about Christian nationalism is accurate. You know, right around the corner from my home, I constantly see these flags on 4x4 pickup trucks going around, all of these things, it's the norm. But even here, when I see our Oklahoma chapter of Black Lives Movement working with the American Indian movement, coming together, advocating for a better place. And even I saw some of that work come to fruition this past fall when we came together to stop the wrongful attempt of execution of Julius Jones here in Oklahoma. I saw our communities working hand in hand. And I'm not so sure how that has occurred in history, but at least in my lifetime, I know that we began that process. We began that journey together, and that's been a blessing and something that I hope we will continue to do, because it's been on purpose why we have been segregated, because people have wanted to normalize our harm, justify the privilege that they've gained from that, and continue the terror that goes on decade after decade. And that's what we are saying, is that no more will we allow that to happen in our world. So I'll turn it over now, and we'll just go. I'm going to go on my screen here as I see them, so you just forgive me. But about 30 seconds, and what would be a message of hope? And we'll start with Dr. Gunning, Dr. Francis.
For me, remembering that the way things are not the way things have to be. Human hands have created this situation. What we're seeing, the kind of injustices that we're talking about are not acts of God, but acts of human will. And since human hands have created it, human hands can recreate it. And so we have to join in that effort together to make that happen. We've seen it happen throughout history. We know it can be possible, but do we have the will to get off the fence, to get out of this middle ground posture of trying to play both sides and stand firmly on the side of doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God?
Thank you, Dr. Francis. And Professor McDougall.
Well, since I have spent so much of my career in the UN, let me end with a story. You know, the first time I walked into the UN as a, you know, elected to a UN body, I walked into a room of 1,000 people. I was the only Black person from the African diaspora in that room. I said, oh my God, I gotta fight these fights alone. It's been a long time, but it's only been in the last few years that there are more, and that now we have identified ourselves as people of African descent. Yes, there are 200,000, 200 million, I say, in Latin America, and that's not counting North America, but now there are, I would say, between 15, 20 million people of African descent in Europe, the EU, the UK, add the Nordic countries, and Eastern Europe. And they are showing up now at the UN, at new institutions in the UN, like the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent that Genell is now a new member of. It is, for me, a sign of hope that one day we will find a way to reconstruct, first deconstruct and then reconstruct that institution to speak truth and power for all of our peoples around the world.
Thank you. Ms. Curry?
Unmute here. Ah, perfect. Thank you. Yes, there is hope. I'm quite hopeful, and as Gay just mentioned, I'm particularly hopeful about what will come from the new permanent forum of people of African descent. And this new forum is just getting started. I'm a member. We've only met twice informally. We're going to meet once a year for the next 3 years. But I'm really hopeful that we will be able to move this agenda forward. It's difficult to fight these battles when you're the only one in the room. There's definitely more to say about, strength. There's something to be said about strength in numbers. And so I think, having 10 of us around the table from different parts of the world to work on this issue, to complement the extensive body of work that exists from mechanisms such as the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, where Gay sits, the Working Group on People of African Descent, and a number of other mechanisms coming out of Durban, and what we hear from the Decade on People of African Descent, and what we hope for in terms of the declaration that we are going to be largely working on in the next 3 years with partners, the declaration that we're preparing for people of African descent. And I'm hopeful, I'm extremely hopeful that something tangible and dynamic and transformative will come out of it, and will not be another UN, just another UN document, but something that really allows people of African descent to their voices to be amplified, for their lives to have a different kind of meaning going forward, for us to really address those systemic, structural, institutional changes, not only to look at the individual rights that they are challenged with, but to really look at the systemic challenges that impede progress on racism and anti-racism in our world. Thank you.
Bishop Eaton.
Thank you. I've heard it said by someone else that they're not optimistic, but they're hopeful. And I think that we've been hearing that from our speakers. This is a human-made structure, and it's we understand it to be just an expression of sin. Racism for us is violence and sin in our definition. But I'm not optimistic that people are just going to say, "Oh, I didn't know that," and things will change. I think as we get closer to seeing that actual change can happen, and it is happening, the more closely those who have this privilege will hold on to it. And we've already seen that with violent and deadly consequences. But my hope isn't in human beings. My hope is in God, and God can bring this about. And I hope that God will soften and change some of our hearts so that we can see that this is in fact the work of the gospel, and that as Jesus said, we will know the truth, and the truth will set us free.
Thank you everyone for your contributions today. As I say, I'm reverent in your presence, that the way our indigenous communities operate is that, for the women of our world and that gender, they're the owners of this earth. And so I'm always reverent in the presence of such a panel such as this. And really, I'm the foreigner. I'm the one who needs to quell my voice, to show that reverence and respect. So hopefully I have been able to do that today. So I'm touched, and I'm thankful to be a part of this. I do want to make mention of a couple of questions. I won't have time to answer them, but from Murray in Anchorage, Alaska, who's Alaska Native, just talked about fatigue from marching 2 years ago, and how do we avoid that fatigue to continue that. And I want to make mention just in our thoughts, we continue to come back that everything we've talked about is not how it should be. It's not reality. Reality is living in harmony. Reality is being able to live with self-determination for our families and all those that come after us. And so just continuing to recognize when we're able to attain that is what I would just share, and come back to our nature as spiritual beings, as people of varying faiths who understand what what hope and what peace and harmony is. And then also there was one other question that I think that what we've talked about today in terms of racism and what we've seen in the United States, there's also, this is just one of the many forms of violence that have existed. And I want to acknowledge that before we close, that there are more conversations on homophobia, on what does it mean to be fully inclusive in our world. And I think I want to make sure I at least make mention of that while it does not do it justice on the compelling our country to continue to move in that direction for affirmation of the many, the elimination of the many forms of violence that exist. But I wanted to put those two out there because I know we did not have time to answer those today. And if you'll join me in prayer, I believe we've come to our time of closing and just a few minutes over, so forgive me for that, but it has been a powerful few moments this morning, this afternoon and evening. So let us pray. Loving God, one who has given all of our people's breath, the breath of life, one who has created all species, all energies of this earth. We humbly ask that you continue to help us to see how to walk reverently in the midst of all of the energy of life, how we proclaim peace, harmony, and even times we must ask for forgiveness when we forget those values that have nurtured our communities for millennia. We pray that you would be with us as we work for a place where all persons have a right to live life to the fullest. And we thank you that we've been able to have this day together in this moment in time. Amen. So thank you, everyone. And I'll just wait here until I'm instructed to do something different.
Thank you so much. This was very rich.